On this edition of Thinking Biblically, we're going to expose Tucker Carlson's misrepresentation of Israel and the Jewish people. Welcome to Thinking Biblically. My name is Alan Gilman. Thinking Biblically is a podcast dedicated to exploring how all of Scripture speaks to all of life. It's been a while since I posted a Thinking Biblically podcast, but I wanted to draw your attention to my weekly Torah Bites messages. Since 1997, I've been providing weekly commentary on the books of Moses, the foundational section of Scripture that is tragically neglected by too many believers. Over the past 8 months, I've begun to provide Torah Bites in video in addition to text and audio. I've placed a link to the Torah Bites playlist in the description. Don't forget to subscribe, and that way you won't miss the latest Torah Bites and any of my other video postings. About a week and a half ago, there was an event in the small farming community of Norwich, Ontario. Norwich is about 150 kilometers, about 90 miles from either downtown Toronto to the east or Buffalo, New York to the west. It was sponsored by the Norwich Bookshop, and about 300 people gathered to hear Canadian-born Israeli rabbi Ilan Mazur, Reformed pastor Reverend Cornelius Sonneveld from the Netherlands, and social commentator Jonathon Van Maren, whose presentation I'm spotlighting here. I've provided the link to all three speakers' talks in the description. Jonathon Van Maren wears many hats. Since 2025, confronting anti-Semitism on both the left and the right has been a particular focus. Not only is he a contributing editor to the European Conservative, his writings have been featured in a wide range of publications, including the National Post, National Review, First Things, The Federalist, The American Conservative, The Jewish Independent, The Times of Israel, and World Magazine. I've known Jonathon for many years and have greatly appreciated not only his perspective, but his ability to communicate it. You might wonder why feature a talk like this on a podcast called Thinking Biblically. Anti-Semitism, Jew hatred in other words, obscures the truth of Scripture. Failing to understand God's enduring faithfulness to the Jewish people undermines the effectiveness of the Bible. The lies being spread by popular commentators like Tucker Carlson are doing great damage. They must be confronted with the truth. And so let's hear what Jonathon Van Maren has to say.
To cover a fairly extensive topic, the issue of how this issue of anti-Semitism and our treatment of the state of Israel intersects with the digital age, how we consume our news, how we process our information. And almost as significant as this is the fact that so much of our news now comes to us as entertainment. And many of us consume our news as entertainment. And even though we are not aware of it, by watching podcasters, by listening to commentary, by consuming short-form videos, even if we recognize intellectually that it's entertainment, often the content still makes an impression on us, especially when we hear certain messages repeated over and over and over again. Now, because I have so little time, I want to address just one issue, which is for Christian communities, a primary danger is the fact that many of the biggest conservative influencers online, with audiences of tens of millions of people and growing influence, present themselves fundamentally as Christian and as Christian sources. They use their Christianity to buttress their credibility and to build a Christian audience. They want Christians to know, I am one of you, so you can believe me. And millions of people trust them because they trust those statements. Now, just to spend about 60 seconds on this, one of the biggest influencers that some of you may have heard of is Candace Owens. I see some of you have heard of her. So she, for example, recently became Catholic, and she makes her Catholicism one of her main selling points. And I don't have time to break down all of the vicious lies that she's told over the past several years, but I want to briefly make the point that Candace Owens is probably the best example of an unambiguous and classic anti-Semite in the public square. In many of the claims that she makes, she has dropped the term Zionist and now simply refers to Jews. I'll just give you 4 of her claims. She has claimed that, quote, Jewish people were in control of the slave trade. This is a long-standing and historically incorrect slander. Very easy to find corrective information, too, I would add. She has recommended and cited a book called The Talmudic Jew, a 19th century book used by the Nazis to push anti-Jewish propaganda. This book was a favorite of Julius Streicher, one of the vilest Nazi propagandists, the editor of Der Stürmer, who was executed after the Nuremberg trials for using his publication to set the stage for the Holocaust. 3, she explicitly repeated one of the very oldest blood libels, that Jewish people were, quote, killing Christian children as part of religious rituals. And 4, she has, this would be hilarious if it wasn't so sinister. She has attempted to link almost every major monster in history to Jewish ancestry, including Joseph Stalin, who was Georgian. And the most ludicrous one was Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, one of the Turkish leaders responsible for the Armenian genocide. Again, the kinds of historical and brazen lies that are being told would seem ludicrous if the intent wasn't so deliberately insidious. So I mentioned those 4 examples to emphasize a single point. Many people watch her as entertainment, but listening to insidious and wicked lies repeated over and over and over again has a real effect on people's thinking. Her views, by the way, are not nuanced. Those 4 examples, I could have filled an hour. But the figure I want to focus on as an example of what we're talking about, of a Christian commentator who is attempting to build credibility by claiming to be a Christian and then using that platform to tell lies, is Tucker Carlson, who for decades was a respected conservative media figure, but in recent years changed his focus almost entirely to focus on Israel. Now, I used to follow a lot of his work. I reviewed several of his books for American magazines. I've met him in person before, and I find him very warm and friendly. And so to see his trajectory in the last couple of years has been very disturbing. Now, he consistently claims that his views are derived from the fact that he is a Christian. But he has consistently and knowingly lied and used Christianity to do it. So let me spend the next few minutes detailing how he has done this. And I want to emphasize here, I'm not questioning all of his views. I agree with some of his views and disagree with others. He said many pro-life things, for example, and so I obviously very much agree with him on that. But what I'm doing is pointing out that he is fundamentally untrustworthy, and that when we are consuming news and information, we need to be discerning about who we choose to listen to, even if they claim to hold the same beliefs that we do. So an examination of Tucker's coverage, for example, of the persecution of Christians is very revelatory. Because what we find when we look at his coverage of the persecution of Christians is that he's not actually interested in the persecution of Christians globally. He is only specifically interested in presenting Israel as a country that persecutes Christians. So since the Hamas terrorist attacks on October 7, he has dedicated episode after episode to making this case. So let's walk through a couple of his claims. He has contrasted Israel with Muslim countries to imply, and in some cases outright claim, that the Islamic world is kinder to Christians than Israel is. In fact, one of the specific examples he gave early on was Jordan. And here is how the Christian group Voice of the Martyrs describes the situation in Jordan. And all you have to do is Google Christians in Jordan, and all of the stuff comes up. It says, Christian converts from Islam are persecuted, sometimes violently, by their families, tribes, and communities. The Jordanian government restricts open evangelism and sometimes also Bible distribution activities, end quote. So then you go to Open Doors, which is the most prominent global watchdog on Christian persecution. They rank Jordan as number 49 on their World Watch list, scores persecution in Jordan as very high, especially for converts from Islam to Christianity. Now, for context, this is an objective persecution watchdog. If you look at Open Doors list, you can run it from the top to the bottom, Israel doesn't actually appear on the list. Now, Tucker knows this. He is a journalist, and he was once a very talented one. He is lying, and he is lying deliberately. He is doing so and this is what made me very angry when I started to see his trajectory, to exploit the very real issue of persecution of Christians for his own political agenda. And regardless of what you think of that agenda, maybe you agree with some of his agenda, that is a particularly slanderous and disgusting tactic. Consider another example, and this one is actually hard to believe. On April 14, Tucker wrote this: "The people in charge don't want you to know this." This is how you know he's about to share secret knowledge that just you and he know now. "But Muslims love Jesus. Islam reveres him as a major prophet and messenger for the Lord, believes he performed miracles, and states that he will return to earth to defeat the Antichrist." Now imagine making that statement, again for the specific purpose of targeting Israel, when more than 10 Muslim countries have the death penalty for those who convert to Christianity. Around 20 others have more moderate punishments, including flogging, imprisonment, loss of custody of your children, or loss of inheritance and marriage rights. According to Open Doors' 2026 report, Islamic extremism was the primary factor for persecution of Christians in 40 of the top 50 most dangerous countries for Christians in the world. But Tucker's mission to run cover for Christian persecutors while accusing Israel of this sin gets worse. According to Open Doors, Nigeria ranks number 7 on the World Watch list and has, quote, been the most violent place in the world for followers of Jesus for several years, end quote. Tens of thousands of Christians have been killed, over 3,000 in 2024 to 2025 alone, accounting for 72% of all faith-based murders worldwide. Last year, however, Tucker invited international human rights lawyer Bob Amsterdam onto his podcast, describing Amsterdam as, quote, defending Christians around the world, and, quote, one of the people that I talk to the most off camera about what is going on with the Christian population of the world. During this discussion, Amsterdam then claimed that the Nigerian Christians are in fact, quote, not targeted as Christians, and insisted that the targeting, murder, and rape of Nigerian Christians is primarily about tribal differences and farmland squabbles. If anybody has further questions about that particular claim, feel free to ask Reverend Sonneveld during the Q&A. He served as a missionary in Nigeria and regularly visits the churches under persecution there. What neither Amsterdam nor Carlson mentioned, actually, is that Amsterdam served as an attorney for Nasser al-Rufai, a Nigerian politician with a documented record of persecuting Christians, as highlighted by Christian Concern International. Many Christian advocacy groups and Nigerian missionaries condemned the comments made by Amsterdam and Carlson. He ignored them. That is because this is not about Christian persecution. It is about a very specific agenda. Not only does he present himself as a defender of persecuted Christians while running cover for persecutors, he consistently states that he holds his political views as a Christian in a deliberate attempt to frame anybody who disagrees with his political views as therefore fundamentally heretical. He said recently while explaining he doesn't go to church, one of the reasons that I have a lot of trouble going to church is because all these Christian leaders are so flawed and obviously fake. I can't deal with it. It freaks me out. In fact, Tucker has described Protestants who support the Jewish state as his enemies. And in a conversation with Nick Fuentes, a Holocaust denier and open admirer of Hitler, he said that Christian Zionists are self-described Christians and that, quote, I can just say for myself, I dislike them more than anybody because it's a Christian heresy and I'm offended by that as a Christian. It's worth noting here that the man who is judging what views are or are not Christian heresies first read the Bible all the way through in 2023. Despite having presented himself as a Christian for years, he says he began reading the Bible after a demon, quote, physically mauled him and left him with scratch marks while he was sleeping in bed with his 4 dogs. A fact to you that I quote without comment. By July of 2023, he was about halfway through the Bible. I want to emphasize here that I am not mocking somebody reading for the Bible for the first time. That is an objectively good thing. But this is a man who has spent years presenting himself as a public Christian and condemning Christians for disagreeing with him. Now, this is where it gets particularly insidious. So just as Tucker has cynically exploited the persecution of Christians worldwide to gain support for his own propaganda war against Israel, he has done the same thing with his newfound interest in Scripture. Earlier this year, he gave this summary of the book of Esther. How many of you have read the book of Esther? That's everybody. Well, let's see if you can pick out what's wrong with his characterization then. Here's how he describes the story. It's the story, among other things, of a genocide of Persians, 75,000 Persians. Not just people who had committed crimes, but people who were Persian, and that's why they were killed. It's in the book of Esther, which you should read because it's interesting, and I wish he had taken his own advice. Because he has deliberately inverted the story of the book of Esther, which is, of course, about a planned genocide of Jewish people, spearheaded by a Persian official, Haman, who was actually an Agagite or an Amalekite. And then, of course, that edict by the king could not be repealed, but due to the advocacy of Queen Esther, a counter-edict was put in place permitting the Jewish people to defend themselves. And not only were they not Persians, and not only, in most cases, were they not, he says they did nothing else. It emphasizes in the scriptural account that this was in self-defense, that they laid not their hand upon the plunder, as in they did not loot the homes, and that those they defended themselves against, those that they killed during this period, were those that sought their hurt. So the scripture could not be clearer on this, and just as a test, I did a kind of a survey to see, is there any Bible scholar that shares this particular interpretation? And you will be unsurprised to hear that there are none. So he is using, almost completely inverting the book of Esther. Why? Because he wants to present Jewish people as genocidal and those who were trying to kill them as the victims. And I will leave you to draw some fairly obvious parallels to what's going on today to yourselves. To sum up, what Tucker called the genocide perpetrated by the Jews against Persians was actually Jews defending themselves against a genocidal edict provoked by one of their ancient enemies. He is reinventing the Bible to suit his agenda, and Christians should be horrified by this. But Tucker does not only accuse the Jews of genocide, very blasphemously, he also accuses God of the same. In an interview with the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, Carlson, in attempting to get Mike Huckabee to say things damaging to Israel, quoted 1 Samuel 15, in which God commands the Israelites to wipe out the Amalekites. And here is how he describes that chapter. That is genocide, Tucker said. God is calling for the genocide of the Amalekites. He goes on in this vein for some time. To be clear, the definition of genocide, the literal breakdown of the term, is race murder. Carlson is accusing God of ordering the Israelites to commit murder in the Old Testament. This is a direct attack on the divine attributes of God and cannot be read any other way. God cannot be guilty of murder because God is God. In my university days, the new atheist movement, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, very often used to make this claim in debate against Christians. They would make the case that God's commands in the Old Testament regarding the Canaanites, regarding the Amalekites, were evidence that even if the Bible was true, then very obviously it was fundamentally immoral. And I have to say, when I was listening to that interview, I never thought that a podcaster who speaks as a Christian, a term he uses almost all the time now, that he would be making the same accusation against the God of the Old Testament that Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and other atheists made. The allegation that Israel is either apathetic to or actively endorses the persecution of Christians is a vile echo of medieval blood libel. To make these claims, you must deliberately ignore the fact that Israel is the only country in the Middle East that legally guarantees religious freedom, as well as the only country where the Christian population has steadily grown from 34,000 in 1948 to 180,000 today. About 80% of these are Arab Christians. In the rest of the Middle East, the Christian population, those places that Tucker praises as great vacation hotspots and places to live for Christians, the Christian population has dropped from about 13% a century ago to 5% today. Israel, according to every top global watchdog on Christian persecution, is the only truly safe place for Christians to live in the entire Middle East. Now, you may agree with some or many of Tucker's political or foreign policy views on a wide range of subjects. But what is very clear, and there are many commentators doing this right now, I have chosen him because I know many people in our community listen to him, that he lies constantly and easily about a wide range of subjects. He exploits Christian persecution and deliberately perverts Scripture for the express purpose of demonizing the Jewish people, and he does this very deliberately. In this new digital age, with influencers pushing anti-Semitic theories as Christians, we must be extraordinarily, careful about who we watch and who we trust. Those are just a couple of examples. Again, as I said, I only have 15 minutes this evening, but there's a sign-up sheet in the back, and if you leave your email address, we'll send out an email tomorrow with all of this information, but also additional information that I would have covered if I had more time, as well as an interview with Reverend David Zadok, Reverend Sonnenveld's friend. He is the pastor of a congregation of Israeli Christians in Israel, and in preparation for this event, I did an hour-long interview with him so he could explain what life is actually like for Christians in Israel, and he directly responds to many of the allegations that are made. And if you leave your email address, all of that will land in your email inbox tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Let me know what you thought of this by leaving a comment. Don't forget to like and to share, and especially to subscribe. You can check out Jonathon Van Maren's writings, podcasts, etc. by going to thebridgehead.ca. That's thebridgehead.ca. I'll put the link, of course, in the description. You can email me directly at comments@thinkingbiblically.ca. Until next time, this is Alan Gilman with Thinking Biblically.